go ahead and hand it over to Megan. So just a quick introduction on Megan. Megan is a just recently passed 4-H Youth Development Agent based out of Prowers County, Colorado. She's now currently working for Legacy Livestock Imaging. So we wrangled her back in to share her expertise with us and you guys tonight. And then she's got a lot of years of experience of raising, exhibiting, and managing market goats and market goat shows. So we're very happy and lucky to have her on tonight. So Megan, I will hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Kenzie. Yes, as Kenzie said, I started my herd. For those of you guys that haven't been on the last 2 weeks with us, I started my herd by catching a goat at the county fair, and I started with 7 wethers and 1 doe. And by the height of my herd, when I was a senior in high school, we had over 80 head. We're now back down around 30 head. My parents still manage the herd of goats, but we've been doing it a while. So this nutrition is kind of tricky when it comes to all livestock. They're about as finicky as a toddler. So I'm gonna break it down to the basics. There's no magic recipe. I can't give you guys a magic ration. Okay, you need to feed X, Y, and Z. And your goats will look fantastic, because it's just like you guys, different things work for different animals. So without further ado, okay, so some really important dates as far as nutrition, really your whole goat project. Really important dates for you guys to know are your spring weigh-in. So you can make sure you're at the spring weigh-in, you get your animal tagged, all of those kind of things, and also your fair weigh-in. Because I had a kid when I was still a 4-H agent that missed a weigh-in and was not able to show as a result. But those dates are also important when it comes to nutrition. We don't want to miss those weigh-ins, so we can show it fair, but we also, that helps us calculate some of our formulas that we're going to go over. So, why does it never go when I want it to? Okay, so the first thing that we need to know using those 2 dates is how many days is my animal on feed. So from your spring weigh-in to your weigh-in at fair, my old county, it varies from county to county, but my old county, it was 97 days between our spring weigh-in and our fair weigh-in. So that's what all of our kids based all of their formulas to be able to figure out through the summer. It can help you figure out your rate of gain. It helps you figure out how much feed you're going to need all summer, things like that. So we've gotten a lot of questions about the last couple of weeks about this. The target weight for goats is 80 to 90 pounds. That's kind of where goats are finished. They're not too heavy. They're not too light. That's where the production side of the market wants them. Granted, if that is the case, not all animals are going to finish at the same rates. We talked about the last couple of weeks, we've talked about how animals finish. They finish from front to back, top to bottom. If an animal is a little bit smaller framed, throwing it back to our selection presentation, if an animal is a little bit smaller framed, 90 pounds is going to look very, very heavy on them. So think about it, someone that is 5'2" and weighs 150 pounds is going to look very different than someone who is 6'2" and 150 pounds. So that target weight, yes, is 80 to 90 pounds, but you also have to be an evaluator of your livestock to be able to figure out what your animal is going to look best at. Now, with that being said, a moderate framed animal that weighs only 65 or 70 pounds, there's not enough pounds of product there. So there's just not enough to even make it worth cutting them up. Heavier animals, regardless of the species, heavier animals are going to have more fat. Fat in goats isn't necessarily a good thing. When cattle are fat, that fat results in marbling, which results in taste. When you get fat in goats and lambs, it really just tastes like gristle. It's gross. So you don't want those animals super fat. They're a little bit leaner of a meat. So in your nutrition, you also have to exercise those animals to try to get rid of the fat and turn it into muscle that is going to be a better tasting product in the end. For those of you guys that have not had goat, I would encourage you to have goat. It's not bad. It's kind of like lamb. It's kind of like any other meat. It really depends on how it's cooked. But it's really not a bad. I like it pulled. That's my favorite way to have it. But it's not a bad meat at all. Like I said, if an animal is too heavy, all that fat is going to have to be trimmed off at the packing house, and it's just wasted product at that point. All right, so rate of gain. This is important so that we know how our animals are growing. Ideally, animals should gain between 0.3 and 0.5 of a pound per day. Kids, especially you older kids, this is a really good showmanship question. A lot of judges will ask how many pounds per day is an animal supposed to gain. It's also a test question. If any of your counties have Premier Exhibitor or Spring Champion or whatever title it is, test, this is another good test question. So your rate of gain formula is the new weight minus the old weight divided by the days on feed. So I'm going to use an example from if we weighed this animal in at our spring weigh-in and it weighed 42 pounds, and then come fair weigh-in, it weighed 88 pounds. So that's the 97 days that I talked about. So this would be the 88 and the 42, that's 46 pounds that animal gained in that time period. Divided by 97 pounds gives you 0.47 of a pound of gain. So almost a half a pound of gain. So this animal in particular is a really good gainer. Very seldom will you find ones that do gain that half a pound. They may gain it early in the year, in the springtime while it's still cool, and then plateau off or dip come the summertime when it gets hot. But goats do struggle to gain. It's pretty unique for them to gain this half a pound. More of them float around this 0.3 of a pound. I encourage you guys to weigh your animals at least 2 more times in the summer, other than your spring weigh-in. That way you have some sort of benchmark for how your animal is doing, other than just walking out in the pen and seeing how they're growing. You actually have a weight and you can do your figures. If I was talking to hog kids, they would be weighing them 4 or 5 times a day, because that's how hog kids work. I don't know why. But you guys should be weighing at least twice. And some of your counties will do midsummer weigh-ins. Some counties have livestock committees or whatever that have access to scales. Some of the FFA chapters have access to scales. You just have to do a little bit of asking around to be able to find that scale. All right. So how much feed should my animal eat per day? So ideally, animals, just like us, animals will eat until they're full. But goats have a habit of, especially when they're babies, they will overeat and they will bloat and eventually die, because typically you don't catch them when they've bloated really bad. You don't catch them early enough. So it's important to not just free choice them when you've bought them from a producer and are working on your market project, because they're pigs. They will just eat and eat and eat because they think they're starving. because goats are just like that. Ideally, a 40 to 60 pound market animal should intake 2 to 2.5 pounds per day. So some of you probably feed with coffee cans. Typically a coffee can, the little coffee cans weigh about 1 pound once you get feed in them. Don't tell a judge, you younger kids, when you get asked what your animal eats, don't tell them, oh, he eats a coffee can of grain. A much more intelligent answer to give them, he eats 2 to 2.5 pounds of grain a day. This is a 16% protein, blah, blah, give them all the facts and figures that will help you in your showmanship. And then a 60 to 100 pound animal should intake 3 to 3.5 pounds a day. Some people are real serious, and they have almost like a little postal scale out there, and they're weighing exactly how many kernels of grain are in their animal's ration. Some people are just throwing them coffee cans. Find what works for you the best, but make sure that you're staying consistent. And if you feel like an animal is starting to plateau off, maybe you give them a little bit more. And then if they're not cleaning it up, you take a little bit of it away. It's a case, kids, that you guys need to be outside with your animals every day, watching how they're eating and what they're cleaning up and what they're not. Based on those figures, we can figure out roughly how many pounds an animal should gain over the summer. So the 97 days that I talked about, at 0.3 of a pound, an animal should gain 29.1 pounds over the course of the summer. Sorry. And then at the 0.5 pound a day, they should gain 53.35 pounds over the summer. Should. That's not always going to happen. Like I talked about just a little bit ago, and I'll talk about again, weather is a factor, whether or not they're comfortable is a factor, environment is a factor. There's all kinds of different factors that can cause them not to gain that. But in an ideal world, this is what they should gain over the summer. All right, so let's see. Okay, so like I talked about at the very beginning, knowing how many days between our spring weigh-in and our fair weigh-in can also help you guys know how much feed you should have on hand. Granted, some of you will get, obviously you don't get your animal the day of spring weigh-in. You will get it previous to that, but this made for easy math, and then you guys can kind of overfigure it. So if we have 97 days between spring weigh-in and our fair weigh-in, and our median is 3 pounds a day. So yes, they're not going to eat as much when they're smaller, but if we overestimate that a little bit, we'll have a little bit of grace. So that comes out to 291 pounds of feed, which is roughly six 50-pound bags of feed per animal. With that being said, animals tend to waste feed. It's just the way it is. So you can expect about a 10% loss from either it getting wet, them not cleaning it up. Goats are really bad. If you have bunks of any nature, goats are really bad about jumping in the bunks and pooping and peeing in their feed. And they obviously won't eat it after that. So expect about a 10% loss, but that gives you some sort of a basis to start off. That way you know how much feed you need all summer long. Okay, Kenzie, go ahead and let's do some questions and then we'll move on.
All right, and feel free, if you're going to address some of these later on, just say you'll get to that in a bit. Let's see. Sorry. Going back to you referenced goat meat and giving it a try. Somebody was asking, where would you get goat meat? Could you buy it at, your
I don't know that I've ever seen it at a grocery store. You could go to a, if I know, like in Greeley where I grew up, there were several ethnic markets, and that is the population that consumes goat meat, whether it be Hispanic, Muslim, whatever. Those are the populations that consume that kind of meat. So if you can find one of those, that might be a location to get some goat meat. Otherwise, you might be able to talk to a producer. I know one year we had one that just was not doing well, and we went ahead and sent it to a local little packing house, and they processed it for us, and we put it in the freezer. Like I said, it's really good pulled with a little bit of barbecue sauce over it. But those are some options.
Great. There's a question. So what if your animal isn't a good gainer?
Unfortunately, there's no magic formula. There's lots of different supplements from lots of different feed companies that you can try. The supplements are hard because it's just like you guys. Not every protein powder that you guys take or might take is going to work for one kid versus another. So supplements can help with some of that. Sometimes animals are just poor gainers. They just don't gain. My very first goat that I had, his name was Hot Shot, and he was ginormous, and he didn't gain. I mean, he was just kind of a shell of a goat. We never, granted, it was our first year and we didn't know anything, but we just never could figure out why he wouldn't gain. He ate everything under the sun, but he didn't convert it very well.
Okay.
So I don't have an honest answer to that other than try some supplements.
All right. There's a question, is too much protein bad? And maybe you'll go into that, but.
Yes, too much it's just like anything. Too much of anything is bad. For a while, my family was feeding an 18% protein to our market wethers because it was convenient that we were also feeding it to our show does. The 18% protein for the show does worked really, really well. Slicked them off really well, added a lot of fat cover to them to make them nice and pretty for the show. It did not work so well for the wethers. The wethers just kind of got roly-poly fat and kind of ugly. Got real fat, paunchy bellies. So yes, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. I would recommend somewhere between a 14 and a 16% protein. That's what we found worked the best. Now, I will tell you all, we never did in my 4-H career, we never did figure out totally the perfect ration. We found pieces and parts that worked for some animals, but not every year did we have a good ration.
All right. Maybe one more if you're up for it, Megan. How do you get your babies to eat grain? So they said, there's your pigs and we'll do anything for hay, but they won't eat grain.
So if they're babies, still on their mamas, we creep feed them. So we have a creep panel, which for those of you guys that maybe don't know what a creep panel is, it's a panel that is designed for those little baby goats to be able to get through, and mom can't. And so we have a small bunk that we fill with a ration. It's the same ration that the does get. They just get it in their little bunk in their creep area to where they can go and get as much feed as they want. If you're free choicing hay and those wethers or babies are just pigging out on hay, you might think about going to a more rationed hay supply. Wethers specifically get big hay bellies on hay, so you guys have to be really careful how much hay you feed them. Otherwise, they will look very bloated. Kind of like a little kid that eats a bunch of popcorn, their bellies blow up quite a bit. So When we were showing wethers, we gave them just like a corner of a flake every 3 days or so, to keep their gut moving, because they need the hay to be able to, my dad used to call it the scratch factor, so keeping their gut working the way it's supposed to. But it was enough to keep their gut moving, but not enough to make them look bloated. So our wethers mostly stayed on a grain diet.
I think I'll save the next one or two till perhaps later when we've got some time. So.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So like I talked about with you guys, factors that will affect gain, feed type and quality. One thing that we discovered early on, goats do not eat fines in feed. So if you have a pelleted feed and there's a lot of dust in it, a lot of hay or grain dust in it, they won't eat it. They don't like it. Quality, sometimes feed comes out of the mill, it goes into the bags too hot and it will mold. Sometimes it gets wet on transportation, it will mold. It's better to spend the extra money and buy a little higher quality feed than just your run-of-the-mill feed store feed. My family, we started out with a Sunglow feed, and then we started with Sunglow, moved to a Ranchway custom mix, and then we moved to a Purina feed, and finally we ended up on an Essential feed. And Essentials is the stuff that we've had the best luck with. As far as the pelleted feed goes, I know a lot of people feed Showtech, and Mormons has a lamb and goat feed as well. I know a lot of people feed that stuff. And if you're a nutrition guru, go for it. We found it easier to feed our animals pelleted stuff, mostly because at the time we didn't know any better. Now our does are on a pellet from Essential, which is the 18% protein. Mom is mixing in a Showtech lamb feed. And then we have down here in southeastern Colorado, we have something called Black Gold, which is a sunflower protein feed, and it really helps slick our does off. I've never heard of anybody trying it with the wethers, but might be a fun experiment. Temperature affects, if it's too cold or too hot, of course, animals will pig out when it's cold because they need that feed to be able to keep their body temperature up. And they won't eat anything when it's hot because nobody wants to eat anything but a popsicle when it's hot. If they're not healthy in any degree, if they have worms, if they have any sort of diseases, if their feet aren't trimmed, all of those kinds of factors can cause them to not gain. Environment, if they're not in a good environment, it's not clean, their water source isn't clean and available for them, they won't gain. And sometimes the poor gainer that somebody asked about earlier, sometimes it's genetics. Sometimes animals just genetically are not good gainers. All right, so especially you older kids, this is a good, I've never heard anybody ask it in showmanship, but a good test question. The 6 essential nutrients, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and water. Those are the 6 essential. Some people condense them down to be 5 essential and combine carbs and fats into energy is what they call it. But those are these are the building blocks of anything, us, animals, tadpoles, whatever. This is the building block of their nutrition. All right, so proteins are the building blocks for producing meat. So your protein should be the highest amount in your feed, I can't think of the word. Anyway, highest percentage in your feed, because this is where your meat and muscle come from. So protein sources: soybean meal, sunflower meal, peanut meal, cottonseed meal, fish meal, and feather meal. At one point in my career, we were feeding it was actually a cattle ration. We were feeding it to our show does, and it had some cottonseed meal in it for that little added bonus protein. Here's your figures for how much protein an animal should have. So your 40 to 60 pounder should have a 16% protein, and your 60 to 100 pounder should have a 15% protein. Sometimes you can get away with as little as a 14% protein. It just kind of depends. But these don't go as high as an 18% protein. It's too much of a good thing. All right, like I said, carbs and fats, they do, some people will combine them under the energy heading. I don't know why. I learned it as carbs and fats, but anyway, this is what gives your animal the ability to move, to eat, to drink, to be active, to exercise, all of those kinds of things. Like I said, fats are what makes a meat taste good. In cattle, we want that nice marbling, that little extra fat. In goats, we don't necessarily want them super fat. We want them pretty lean, because otherwise they just taste ucky. So your energy sources are corn, wheat, barley, oats, and alfalfa. A lot of your feeds are going to be corn-based. Oats is that's more of a horse thing. But it's good information for you guys to know regardless of the species. Alfalfa, if you're feeding hay, alfalfa does have a higher amount of protein in it, but it is still okay to feed them grass hay. They're not going to be as pot-bellied on grass hay as they will be on alfalfa, but there's still some pot-belliedness that will happen. All right, vitamins and minerals. These are very, very important for anybody that is producing livestock, regardless of the species. Make sure you have free choice mineral out for them, whether it's a block, a tub. We used to feed like a granulated in a bucket. Whatever it is, make sure you have some sort of free choice out for them, because otherwise you end up with this. This was a little wether. I think it was a wether. It might have been a doe. Anyway, some people that we had bred some animals for, they called one day very, very panicked. This doe was struggling to give birth, and so I had to pull this poor baby. And this is what this baby came out as. And after a lot of research, it was because there was no mineral in this doe's diet. This right here, this bulge in this baby's neck, is a goiter, and that comes from, goats are pretty prone to it. That comes from a iodine deficiency. But this is the result. If you don't feed your animals, especially when they're in production, you don't feed them free choice minerals. So minerals are divided into macro and micro nutrients. Your macros are calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium chloride, and sulfur. So these are the ones that they need in the highest concentrations. Any of you older kids or parents, kicking it way back to science class, calcium and phosphorus are particularly important for several body functions. There's lots of, I forget exactly, but there's lots of cells in our body that need those two specifically to perform their jobs. So these are really important. Your micronutrients are copper, iodine, iron, manganese, molybdenum, selenium, and zinc. Some people might, yes, I can't speak today apparently. Some people might, those that are cattle producers, There are areas of our state that are deficient in selenium or really, really high. They're actually toxic in selenium. So it's important for you guys to, goats don't seem to have that problem, but it is important for you guys to pay attention to what part of the state you're in, and what stuff is naturally occurring in the soil. That goats are nibblers. They nibble on all kinds of things. So make sure you know what they're nibbling on. Like I said, iodine deficiency, that causes a goiter. Copper, we have discovered if anybody has goats that lose their tail hair, they lose a little bit of tail hair to where you can see the tip of their tail, their tailbone, it's usually a copper deficiency. So again, very, very important to make sure that there are free choice mineral out for your animals. Whoops, whoa, whoa. Sorry.
I stepped away.
You're okay. Apparently we're on the struggle bus today. Okay, so vitamins are, stop touching your mouse pad. Vitamins are really important for an immune system. Our vet, anytime we called him with an issue, he would typically tell us to give a shot of vitamin B. It just is an immune system booster. Vitamins are broken into fat soluble and water soluble, which if it was a different day, I maybe could explain the science behind that. But your fat solubles are A, D, E, and K, and your water solubles are B complex vitamins and vitamin C. And some of those are naturally occurring. Some of those they need specific supplements to be able to get a hold of. I couldn't name the specific supplements off the top of my head, but I know that there are some, depending on the feed company, there are different supplements that supply those vitamins. Some of your free choice mineral also has some of the vitamins packed into it, depending on whether it's a salt lick or it's a tub or whatever it may be. So again, this is what happens when you don't feed mineral. All right, this is a really important thing for all of you kids to know. Water is the most important nutrient. This is a test question. It always trips people up. People always want to answer protein. No, it's water. Water is the most important nutrient for an animal. Goats should drink 1 to 2 gallons of water a day. I'm not telling you guys by any means to regulate their water and go out and check, oh, did they drink their 1 to 2 gallons a day? Just be wary of how much water they are or are not drinking. Because if an animal gets dehydrated, just like us, it can lead to further issues. Make sure that they have water available at all times, and make sure their buckets or their tanks are clean. Also, make sure in the wintertime, any of you guys producing dough, showing does, make sure those are clean of ice. Goats don't like to drink around ice, so make sure you go ahead and just shovel all that ice out in the wintertime. All right, so some of you have seen one of these, most of you have seen one of these. Some of you have probably never paid attention to one of these, but this is your feed tag. So up here at the top, this is your brand name, product name, whatever it may be. So for those of you, if you have a Showtech feed, it might say Showtech, and then whatever goat developer or whatever it is. This one in particular, I didn't realize until just now, is for horses, but it's a feed tag regardless. Right here is your ingredients. So it's going to show you it's going to tell you everything that is in this feed. Like I said, there's some B vitamins. There's some of those micronutrients that they need in this feed. So just when you go to switch feeds, pay attention to what's in the nutrient list, not just up here in your guaranteed analysis, which is your percentages of how much protein, how much fat, how much fiber, blah, blah, blah. Pay attention to what the actual ingredients are. This is your caution statement down here. Most feed tags have some sort of caution statement. It's a requirement by most manufacturers. If you guys are feeding a medicated feed, it will be stamped across medicated. And for some of you, it depends on your county requirements, but when you go to fill out your record books, some of your counties may want it noted that you're feeding a medicated feed, because it is, even though it's medicated, most of the time, because it's in a feed, it doesn't have a withdrawal time, or a withdrawal time that extends upon the end of feeding. But they still want to know that you're feeding a medicated feed. Goats are really prone to stones and urinary calculi. So we always made sure, specifically wethers and bucks. Does aren't as much, but when we were showing wethers, we made sure that we were feeding a feed that had monensin in it, to help with that urinary calculi and those stones. Manufacturers information down here. If you guys get a bad run of feed, if you go to the feed store and you open several bags and they're bad, contact the feed store. But if they can't help you, go ahead and contact the manufacturer directly, and they can hopefully recall that run of feed. And then, like I said, feeding instructions. So if this was goats, obviously we're not a pregnant mare, but some feed tags will tell you exactly what you need to feed per pound, how heavy your animals are, all of those good things. All right. So this is, I think, my last slide. Yep. So make sure you're reading your feed tag. Make sure you are checking what all is in your feed, free choice mineral, those animals. We also took to feeding animals individually. Yes, I understand that requires you kids to be out there longer doing your chores versus doing whatever you kids do these days. But it will be worth your time to feed them on their own versus trying to feed them as a group, because there's always a bully in the group and there's always a weak one in the group. The weak one will get pushed out of the bunk, won't get as much feed. The bully will pig out. So we built my dad called them jugs. We built little runs to where everybody got their individual feed. We also, when we exercised our animals, we would take them down the road. It was about a mile by the time we got to the stop sign. So we would walk them down the road. That was our walking practice for the day, like we talked about last week. Walk them down to the stop sign, and then we would turn them off their leashes and run them back. Yes, it was exercise for everybody involved. Children, goats, all the above. And then we fed our animals after we got back from that run, because it was a reward for them not just wanting to go down in the bar ditches and eat grass. When you purchase your feed, make sure it's in a clean, dry place. Try to protect it from rodents. You could talk to any producer in the country and they've had a feed bag broke by a mouse. It just happens. But try your very best to keep it in a clean, dry, you don't want it a super humid place. Make sure your feed buckets are nice and clean. Goats don't like old feed and they won't eat it if it's wet. So make sure every morning you dump those feed buckets out. Don't just throw the old feed on top. Okay, what do you got for me?
Alrighty, so we have a question. If you're feeding your goats alfalfa pellets and a sort of mixed feeds, but they're only eating the mixed feed, what should you do?
They're eating the mixed feed and not eating the alfalfa. Okay.
Correct.
I would say that could potentially be a palatability thing. The goats may not like the way that the alfalfa pellet tastes. If possible, maybe stop feeding the alfalfa pellets and go to an actual hay. Like I said, you have to be really, really careful with hay because it will cause them to bloat. But if you can give them the actual hay, they may prefer that over the alfalfa pellet.
Unmute myself here. Let's see. The age-old question, if you feel comfortable answering this, what feed brand do you recommend?
Like I said, we found the best luck with essentials. Essential feeds, there's lots of dealers all over everywhere. Showtech, Mormons, Purina, they're all reputable feeds. Sunglow is not really a thing. Very few people feed Sunglow feeds anymore. Ranchway, now that it's under new management, the mill is quite a bit different for those that are Colorado kids. We bought very beginning, we bought a just feed store brand. We had no luck with that. Essentials is what we've had the best luck with, or a completely custom ration from a mill.
All right, we've got, let's see, in regards to minerals, can we use a horse mineral block?
Our mineral blocks that we threw out for the goats, we had cattle blocks. So they're that kind of reddish, brownish looking ones. We also threw them out for our horses, but it was specifically a cattle block. They do make so yes, I believe so. Mineral is mineral. But they do also make a granulated goat specific mineral. That's something we bought, or we ended up with one of those mineral feeders that you might set out in a field and it spins, but it's covered. We bought one of those only because that granulated mineral, if it gets wet, it becomes a brick and then they don't want it.
All right, we have, is it a good idea to reward your goats after you walk them? And if so, would you suggest, or what would you suggest as a good healthy treat?
Like I said, when we worked our goats, we would walk them down to the stop sign and run them back and then feed them. That's the best reward for them. Just go ahead and feed them after you work them. One tidbit that I would tell you guys for showmanship: don't get your animals out of their pens too early for showmanship. I know you little kids specifically get very antsy and want to show your goats, and your goats will get tired very quickly, and then they're not going to show in the show ring. But also, it helps to give them a little handful of grain before you show them. Not a whole lot to where they're full, just enough to keep them focused. Kind of like during a volleyball game, you might eat a little bit of some peanut M&Ms. That way your energy and your focus is up, but you're not so full that you're just miserable.
Great, so we have, let's see, in response to the stones and the urinary calculi for the wethers, how would you know that your wethers are suffering from that?
They are unable to urinate. So if you notice, and they'll get bloated because their bladder will fill with urine and they have no way to get rid of it. So that can cause some bloat issues and some other issues. They will most likely exhibit a high temperature, which if you guys were on, I think that was that our first week? Anyway, goats' temperature normal range is 101 to 102. So if they're higher than that, that could be an indicator. If they're kind of depressed looking, laying off by themselves, they lay flat on their sides and kind of are just not comfortable, that's a good indication. But the number one indication is they are unable to pee.
Great. We've got another one. What is a good way to switch from creep to show feed?
So anytime you switch an animal's feed, you want to do it very, very gradually. You don't want to just take them off of one feed and dump the new feed. You're going to cause more problems than do good. So you want to make that switch very slowly. What I would recommend doing is mixing the two feeds for a little bit and eventually plan it out to where you're going to run out of the creep feed. And eventually, once you've mixed your feed, I would mix probably a week and a half to 2 weeks before you take them completely off the creep feed. Especially when they're babies, their guts are much more sensitive than an older, more mature animal. So switching them too quickly can cause diarrhea and all kinds of other issues.
Alrighty. We've got, what do you recommend? Because I put my feed like alfalfa in my hanging feeder, and I put my show feed or my show edge and a sweet mix together and then stir it in with the hay. Would that be a good feeding idea, or would you recommend switching foods, it sounds like?
Okay, so again, you guys don't want to feed your animals a bunch of hay. You want them just a little bit of hay, enough to be able to keep their gut going, like a half. If you're feeding a little small bales, I would say half a flake a day, every 2 to 3 days. And if you're feeding a bigger bale, I would say a quarter of a flake a day, every 2 to 3 days. So I would not recommend mixing your hay and your grain together. I would feed your grain in a separate feeder, because that's what you want. The grain is like candy to them. Alfalfa is also a little bit of candy to them, but you don't want them not eating the grain because of the hay.
All right. Let's see. Do goats like tomatoes? That's a question you got. Do goats like tomatoes, or should you feed them, maybe, is a better question.
I have no idea. I've never actually fed goats tomatoes. Goats, fun fact, goats are not like everybody thinks they are. They do not eat everything under the sun. They're actually pretty picky. I would not probably recommend feeding them tomatoes. I would think that the acid in the tomatoes is probably too high for their guts. So I would not recommend that.
All right. We've got, how do you check a goat's temperature?
Okay, so the only way to check goats' temperatures, you have to do it rectally. So you need you'll have to go probably to a vet supply store and purchase an animal thermometer. You cannot use one like what you would stick in your ear for you kiddos. You need a animal rectal thermometer. Depending on the type of thermometer, they make digital ones now that are a little bit bigger. But if you have an old school one, tie a string to it, because the last thing you want to do, goats cough, and when they cough, sometimes they fart, and sometimes they will suck that thermometer inside them, and you don't want to have to go digging for it, is what I'm trying to say. But make sure that you are getting an animal thermometer. Don't just go to the drugstore and get one that you would use on a human.